On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, crippling the American Pacific Fleet and drawing the United States into World War II. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto famously remarked after the attack that they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. What Yamamoto understood, and what many in the Japanese Imperial Command would soon discover, was that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not the decisive blow they had hoped for. It was merely the beginning of America's transformation into the most formidable naval power the world had ever seen. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Japan appeared unstoppable. Their forces swept across the Pacific with remarkable speed and efficiency. They captured Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun seemed invincible, and Japanese military leadership believed they had achieved their strategic objective, creating an impenetrable defensive perimeter that would force America to negotiate peace terms favorable to Japan. The Japanese strategy was built on a fundamental miscalculation. They believed that American resolve would crumble after initial defeats, that the United States lacked the will to fight a prolonged war across the vast Pacific. They underestimated not just American determination, but more critically, they failed to comprehend the sheer industrial capacity of their enemy. Within months of Pearl Harbor, American shipyards began an unprecedented mobilization. Factories that had produced automobiles and refrigerators were retooled for war production. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, revolutionized naval construction with assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. What had once taken years to build could now be completed in months, then weeks. Liberty ships, essential cargo vessels, were being launched at an astonishing rate. On November 12, 1942, the SS Robert E. Peary was built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. This was more than just impressive engineering. It was a demonstration of industrial might that Japan simply could not match. The first crack in Japanese confidence came at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. This was the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never directly sighted each other. Everything was conducted by aircraft carriers and their planes. The battle was technically a tactical victory for Japan as they sank the American carrier USS Lexington and damaged the USS Yorktown. But strategically, it was a Japanese defeat. Their advance toward Port Moresby was halted, and critically, 2 of their carriers suffered enough damage that they could not participate in the upcoming operation at Midway. The Japanese carrier Shokaku needed months of repairs, and the Zuikaku lost most of its experienced air crews. Then came June 1942, and the Battle of Midway, the turning point that would forever alter the trajectory of the Pacific War. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto planned to draw out and destroy what remained of the American carrier fleet by attacking Midway Atoll. He believed the Americans would be forced to defend this strategic outpost, giving Japan the decisive naval engagement they sought. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew exactly when and where the Japanese fleet would strike. The Americans positioned 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, in a perfect ambush position. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers launched their first strike against Midway Island itself. This decision would prove fatal. While Japanese planes were attacking the island, American torpedo bombers found the Japanese fleet. Wave after wave of American Devastator torpedo bombers pressed home their attacks with suicidal bravery. They were slaughtered. Of the 41 Devastators from Hornet and Enterprise, 35 were shot down without scoring a single hit. But their sacrifice was not in vain. They pulled Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable. At precisely 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared overhead. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were caught at their most vulnerable moment, with fuel lines running across their decks and armed aircraft ready for launch. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were blazing wrecks. Later that day, the Hiryu was also destroyed. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway, along with all their aircraft and most of their highly trained pilots and crew. These were losses Japan could never replace. The battle had lasted just 3 days, but it fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Yet even after Midway, Japanese leadership did not fully comprehend what was coming. They still believed they could win through superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence. They failed to understand that America was about to unleash an industrial tsunami that would overwhelm them through sheer material superiority. The Guadalcanal campaign that began in August 1942 was a brutal, grinding affair that lasted 6 months. It was here that Japan began to truly understand the nature of their enemy. The battles around Guadalcanal were savage and relentless. The naval engagements in what became known as Iron Bottom Sound saw ships fighting at point-blank range in nighttime battles. The Japanese Navy demonstrated its superiority in night combat, sinking numerous American cruisers and destroyers, but every ship they sank was replaced. Every aircraft shot down was replaced. Every Marine killed was replaced. Japan was fighting an enemy that could absorb losses that would cripple any other nation and simply build more, train more, send more. By 1943, the disparity was becoming stark and undeniable. American shipyards were launching escort carriers at the rate of 1 per week. Fleet carriers like the Essex class were being commissioned at an unprecedented pace. The Essex alone was followed by Lexington, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, and many more. Each one was larger, faster, and carried more aircraft than their Japanese counterparts. In contrast, Japan completed only 6 fleet carriers during the entire war, and 3 of those were conversions from other ship types. The Japanese carrier Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, was the largest carrier ever built at that time. It was sunk by an American submarine just 10 days after commissioning, before it could enter combat service. American submarines were also taking a devastating toll on Japanese shipping. At the war's start, American torpedoes were plagued with defects. They ran too deep, their magnetic detonators failed, and their contact exploders were poorly designed. But once these problems were corrected in 1943, American submarines became a lethal force. They systematically destroyed Japan's merchant fleet, cutting the home islands off from the resources of their conquered territories. Oil tankers, cargo ships, and troop transports went to the bottom at an alarming rate. By 1944, Japan's economy was strangling. Raw materials couldn't reach factories, finished goods couldn't reach troops, and fuel oil was becoming critically scarce. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. Japan had launched Operation Ago, throwing everything they had at the American fleet supporting the invasion of Saipan. The Japanese still had carriers and planes, but what they didn't have were experienced pilots. The veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor and fought at Coral Sea and Midway were mostly dead. Their replacements had minimal training due to fuel shortages and the accelerated pace of the war. When Japanese aircraft attacked the American fleet on June 19, 1944, they flew into a wall of defensive fire unlike anything ever seen before. American radar picked them up at great distances. New fighter direction techniques vectored swarms of F-6F Hellcat fighters to intercept them. New proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells created lethal airbursts. The Japanese lost approximately 300 aircraft in a single day. American losses were about 30 planes. It was a massacre. The following day, American aircraft struck the Japanese fleet, sinking the carrier Hio and damaging 2 others. More critically, Japan lost so many trained pilots that their carrier fleet was effectively finished as an offensive force. The remaining carriers would be used as decoys in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, sacrificed to draw American forces away from the landing beaches. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval battle in history. Japan threw everything it had left into a desperate attempt to destroy the American landing forces in the Philippines. The plan was complex, involving multiple Japanese fleets attacking from different directions. The center force, built around the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, would push through the San Bernardino Strait. The southern force would come through Surigao Strait. The northern force, centered on Japan's remaining carriers, would lure the American fast carriers away from the landing beaches. The Japanese plan almost worked. American Admiral Halsey took the bait, chasing the Japanese carriers north and leaving the landing beaches vulnerable. The center force, despite losing the Musashi to air attack, broke through San Bernardino Strait and appeared off Sama Island, where only a handful of American escort carriers and destroyers stood between them and the invasion fleet. What followed was one of the most dramatic actions of the Pacific War. American destroyers and destroyer escorts launched suicidal attacks against Japanese battleships and cruisers. Escort carriers sent up every plane they had, some attacking with depth charges meant for submarines because that's all they had. The small American force fought with such ferocity that the Japanese commander believed he faced a much larger force. After sinking several American ships, he withdrew, convinced he was sailing into a trap. Meanwhile, at Surigao Strait, the Japanese Southern Force sailed into the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. American battleships, many of them raised from the mud at Pearl Harbor, crossed the T in a perfect tactical formation and obliterated the Japanese force with overwhelming firepower. It was revenge served cold. The Battle of Leyte Gulf cost Japan 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. American losses were 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and 3 destroyers. The disparity was crushing and complete. It was during this battle that Japan introduced a new weapon born of desperation: the kamikaze. When conventional attacks failed to inflict significant damage on American ships protected by layers of fighters and anti-aircraft fire, Japan turned to suicide attacks. Young pilots, often with minimal training, would deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships. The kamikazes were terrifying and initially effective, but they were also a symptom of Japan's collapse. A nation that had to expend pilots like ammunition was a nation that had already lost. The kamikaze attacks would intensify during the Okinawa campaign in 1945, sinking dozens of American ships and killing thousands of sailors. But they could not alter the war's trajectory. For every kamikaze that struck home, dozens were shot down, and America simply built more ships. By early 1945, American carriers were launching strikes directly against the Japanese home islands. Massive fleet formations, sometimes including more than a dozen fleet carriers escorted by scores of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, operated with impunity off the Japanese coast. The Imperial Japanese Navy could do nothing to stop them. Japan's remaining ships hid in ports, unable to sortie due to lack of fuel and air cover. The battleship Yamato, the largest ever built and the pride of the Japanese Navy, was sent on a one-way suicide mission during the Battle of Okinawa in April 1945. It was given only enough fuel for a one-way trip, ordered to beach itself and fight as a stationary fortress. It never came close. American aircraft caught Yamato in the open sea and subjected it to hours of relentless attacks. The mighty battleship, symbol of Japanese naval power, capsized and exploded, taking most of its crew to the bottom. The moment Japan truly realized the full extent of American naval might wasn't a single battle or event, but a gradual, crushing realization that built from midway through Guadalcanal, accelerated through the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, and culminated in the absolute dominance of American forces off Japan itself in 1945. Japanese military leaders watched as American shipyards produced more tonnage in a single year than Japan produced during the entire war. They saw American carriers operating with complete air supremacy. They witnessed the systematic destruction of their merchant fleet. They experienced the isolation as American submarines and mines cut off all maritime trade. They endured carrier strikes and battleship bombardments of their home islands while being powerless to respond. Admiral Yamamoto's prescient warning after Pearl Harbor had come true. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity in a way few other Japanese officers did. He had opposed war with the United States, knowing that Japan might win battles for 6 months or a year, but could not win a prolonged conflict. His assassination by American aircraft in 1943, when cryptanalysts intercepted his travel itinerary, removed one of the few voices in Japanese leadership who truly understood their situation. The numbers tell the story starkly. In 1941, the United States Navy had 7 aircraft carriers. By 1945, it had 99 carriers of all types. Japan began the war with 10 carriers and ended with most sunk or damaged beyond repair. The United States built 147 aircraft carriers during World War II. Japan built 17. The United States produced 300,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced 76,000. In shipbuilding, the disparity was even more dramatic. American yards launched 2,610 major warships during the war. Japanese yards launched 670. The Essex-class carriers became symbols of American naval dominance. 24 were built, each displacing 27,000 tons and carrying 90 aircraft. They were fast, well-protected, and had such enormous capacity for absorbing damage that several survived multiple kamikaze hits and continued fighting. The USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs that penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay, causing catastrophic fires and explosions. Over 800 of her crew were killed, yet the ship survived and made it back to port under its own power. This resilience, this ability to take punishment that would sink other ships and keep fighting, exemplified the American naval philosophy. Build them tough, build them strong, and build lots of them. American naval aviation also evolved with stunning speed. The F-4F Wildcat that fought at Midway was inferior to the Japanese Zero in speed and maneuverability, though more rugged. By 1943, the F-6F Hellcat had arrived, superior to the Zero in almost every respect. It was faster, climbed better, dove faster, and could absorb tremendous battle damage. Hellcat pilots achieved a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. Later, the F-4U Corsair, with its distinctive inverted gull wings, proved even more formidable. American aircraft carriers operated with an efficiency that Japan could never match. The United States developed deck crews and procedures that could launch and recover aircraft at rates that seemed impossible to Japanese observers. Coordinated strikes involving hundreds of aircraft from multiple carriers hit targets with devastating precision. American carriers pioneered night operations, launching strikes in darkness using radar-equipped aircraft, a capability Japan never achieved. The submarine war, often overlooked in narratives focused on carrier battles, was devastating for Japan. American submarines accounted for 55% of all Japanese ships sunk during the war, including 8 carriers and numerous cruisers and destroyers. They strangled Japan's economy by sinking 1,178 merchant ships totaling 5 million tons. Oil tankers were priority targets, and by 1945, almost no oil was reaching Japan from the Dutch East Indies. Without fuel, Japan's remaining warships were helpless. Aircraft couldn't fly, factories couldn't operate. The technological gap also widened as the war progressed. American ships benefited from radar fire control, proximity-fused ammunition, and sophisticated damage control systems. The United States developed and deployed ship-based combat information centers, where radar data was compiled and analyzed, giving commanders an unprecedented picture of the battlefield. Japanese ships largely lacked these capabilities. Their night-fighting prowess, which had been formidable early in the war, was negated by American radar. American ships could track and target Japanese vessels in complete darkness from distances far beyond visual range. American industrial capacity extended beyond just numbers. The quality of American equipment improved continuously throughout the war. Ships received constant upgrades. New aircraft models appeared with stunning frequency. Radar and radio equipment became more sophisticated. By contrast, Japanese equipment stagnated. Fuel shortages meant pilots couldn't train properly. Material shortages meant ships couldn't be maintained. The Zero fighter that had been formidable in 1941 was obsolete by 1944. But Japan had no adequate replacement in sufficient numbers. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. Early in the war, Japanese soldiers and sailors believed in their invincibility. They had conquered half of Asia and the Pacific. But as the war progressed and American forces kept coming, kept fighting, and kept winning, that confidence evaporated. American forces suffered defeats early in the war, at places like Savo Island and Tassafaronga, where Japanese forces demonstrated superior night-fighting skills. But America learned from defeats, adapted tactics, developed new technologies, and came back stronger. Japan had no such capacity for adaptation and regeneration. By mid-1945, the situation was apocalyptic from Japan's perspective. American carriers ranged freely along Japanese coasts, striking at will. Battleships and cruisers bombarded coastal cities and factories with impunity. Submarines hunted the few remaining Japanese ships that dared to venture out. The skies over Japan were filled with American aircraft. B-29 bombers flew from the Marianas to firebomb Japanese cities. Navy aircraft from carriers added to the destruction. Japan had been reduced to hiding ships in remote anchorages, dispersing aircraft to avoid destruction, and training boys to fly suicide missions because there was nothing else left. The Imperial Japanese Navy that had struck Pearl Harbor with such skill and confidence had been utterly destroyed. Not just defeated, but annihilated. Its ships rested on the ocean floor or sat damaged in harbors without fuel to move. Its pilots were dead or so poorly trained they could barely fly, let alone fight. Its admirals had no answers except desperate measures like kamikazes and suicide battleship runs. The moment of full realization likely varied among Japanese leaders. Some understood early, perhaps after Midway. Others clung to hope through the Solomons campaign or the Philippines, but by 1945, even the most optimistic could not deny reality. American naval power had not just matched Japan's early advantage, it had surpassed it to a degree that seemed almost supernatural. The same nation that Japan had believed would lack the will to fight had instead prosecuted the war with relentless determination and overwhelming material superiority. American naval might in the Pacific wasn't just about having more ships and planes, though that was certainly part of it. It was about industrial capacity, technological innovation, tactical flexibility, and an ability to learn from defeats and adapt. It was about a system that could take raw recruits and turn them into effective sailors and pilots in months. It was about shipyards that worked around the clock, factories that never stopped producing, and a nation fully mobilized for war. The Japanese strategy had been based on achieving quick victories, establishing a defensive perimeter, and then negotiating from a position of strength. They assumed American morale would crack, that the United States would tire of a distant war and agree to recognize Japan's conquests. This was a fundamental misreading of American character and capability. Once aroused, America brought to bear resources that no nation could match. The United States outbuilt, outproduced, and outfought Japan in every category. Today, historians debate various aspects of the Pacific War, whether the atomic bombs were necessary, whether the island-hopping campaign was the most efficient strategy, whether certain battles could have been won more decisively. But one fact remains indisputable. American naval power, once fully mobilized, was overwhelming and unstoppable. The transformation from the burning ships at Pearl Harbor to the massive carrier task forces operating off Japan in 1945 stands as one of the most remarkable military achievements in history. In less than 4 years, the United States built a navy that dwarfed not just Japan's fleet, but the combined navies of all other nations. This wasn't simply a matter of spending money or having factories, though both were necessary. It required coordination between government, industry, and military on an unprecedented scale. It demanded innovation in manufacturing, tactics, and technology. It needed millions of men and women willing to serve, work, and sacrifice. The day Japan realized America's true naval might was not a single day, but a dawning horror that grew with each passing month of the war. After Midway, some understood. After the Philippine Sea, more understood. After Leyte Gulf, nearly all understood. By 1945, understanding had given way to despair. The empire that had dreamed of dominating the Pacific found itself helpless before a force it had awakened and could not stop. Admiral Yamamoto had been right. They had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had risen with terrible resolve and utterly overwhelming power. The lesson would echo through history. Never underestimate American industrial capacity, and never assume that early victories determine the outcome of a long war. In the end, America's naval might was demonstrated not just in battles won, but in the sheer, crushing weight of material superiority that made Japanese defeat inevitable. The carriers, battleships, submarines, and aircraft that filled the Pacific were more than weapons. They were symbols of a nation's determination, capability, and power. Japan had gambled that America would lack the will to fight. They lost that gamble in the most complete and devastating way imaginable. The Imperial Japanese Navy that had begun the war in a blaze of conquest ended it on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, a cautionary tale about the price of miscalculation and the terrible power of a fully aroused America committed to total victory. On June 4th, the battle begins. Japanese aircraft pound Midway's installations, but American torpedo bombers attack the Japanese carriers at the critical moment when their decks are crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The torpedo attacks fail catastrophically, with most American planes shot down, but they pull the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. Then the American dive bombers arrive. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, become floating infernos. A fourth, Hiryu launches a counterattack that cripples Yorktown before succumbing herself. By the battle's end, Japan has lost 4 carriers that took years to build and trained aircrews that cannot be quickly replaced. In Japanese naval headquarters, officers struggle to comprehend the defeat. These were not just 4 ships. These were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the carriers whose crews represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation. The planes that attacked Hawaii, that struck Darwin, that raided into the Indian Ocean, now rest on the Pacific floor. But Midway represents more than just a military defeat. It marks the moment when Japanese naval dominance begins its irreversible decline. The battle proves that American intelligence can penetrate Japanese communications. It demonstrates that American pilots and tactics can defeat the vaunted Japanese naval air arm. Most critically, it reveals that American industrial capacity can replace losses faster than Japan can inflict them. At Pearl Harbor's repair facilities, workers labor around the clock. 3 of the battleships sunk or damaged on December 7th are already returning to service. California and West Virginia are being raised from the harbor bottom. Maryland and Tennessee were repaired in weeks. Even the capsized Oklahoma is being righted. The harbor that seemed destroyed 6 months earlier is becoming a hive of reconstruction and expansion. Meanwhile, across the American mainland, a transformation unprecedented in human history unfolds. In February 1942, the first keel was laid for an Essex-class aircraft carrier. These ships, displacing 27,000 tons and capable of carrying 90 aircraft, begin rolling out of American shipyards with assembly line efficiency. The first, Essex herself, will be commissioned in December 1942, just 10 months after construction began. But carriers represent only part of the story. Henry Kaiser revolutionizes shipbuilding with prefabrication techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. His Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels, begin launching at a rate Japan cannot comprehend. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, is built in just 4.5 days from keel laying to launch. By 1943, American shipyards launch more tonnage every month than Japan builds in an entire year. Japanese naval intelligence officers compile reports throughout 1943 with growing alarm. The numbers seem impossible. American shipyards deliver 9 new Essex-class carriers. Dozens of smaller escort carriers join the fleet. Hundreds of destroyers and destroyer escorts commission. Thousands of landing craft roll off production lines. At Willow Run, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company operates the largest manufacturing facility ever built. 1 mile long and 1/4 mile wide, this single factory produces B-24 Liberator bombers at a peak rate of 1 per hour. Similar stories repeat across America. Boeing plants in Seattle multiply production of B-17 Flying Fortresses. Grumman on Long Island churns out Navy fighters. Consolidated in San Diego builds flying boats and patrol bombers. The statistics become overwhelming. In 1941, America produced 19,000 aircraft. In 1942, that number reaches 47,000. By 1943, American factories deliver 85,000 aircraft. Japanese industry, already stretched thin across multiple war fronts, produces roughly 8,000 aircraft in 1941, 8,800 in 1942, and 16,700 in 1943. The ratio tells the story of an unwinnable war, but raw numbers only begin to describe the transformation. American training programs, once criticized as too short, now produce adequate pilots in 6 to 9 months. Japanese training programs, already longer, must become even more extensive as experienced instructors die in combat. America can afford to hold back its best pilots as instructors. Japan must throw everyone into battle, bleeding expertise that can never be recovered. The Solomon Islands campaign demonstrates the new reality. From August 1942 through February 1943, Japanese and American forces fight savage battles for control of Guadalcanal. On land, at sea, and in the air, both sides suffer heavy losses. But while America replaces lost ships and planes within months, Japanese losses become permanent deficits. By late 1943, American submarines begin to strangle Japan's maritime supply lines. Operating with improved torpedoes and increasingly bold tactics, American submarines sink Japanese merchant ships faster than they can be replaced. Japan's economy depends on imports of oil, rubber, rice, and raw materials from conquered territories. As the merchant fleet shrinks, Japan's war-making capacity withers. Japanese naval planners face an impossible calculation. They can neither match American production nor protect their supply lines. Every major battle accelerates their decline. Remaining in port preserves ships but accomplishes nothing. Seeking battle risks catastrophic losses. There are no good options, only choices between different speeds of defeat. In Tokyo, some officers begin advocating for the decisive battle doctrine. Rather than accept slow strangulation, they argue for concentrating remaining forces for one massive engagement that might turn the war's momentum. The philosophy reveals desperation rather than strategy, but desperation becomes Japan's primary resource as 1943 turns to 1944. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea stretches empty and blue west of the Mariana Islands. Beneath that peaceful surface, two massive fleets maneuver toward confrontation. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commands 9 Japanese carriers with 450 aircraft. Admiral Raymond Spruance leads 15 American carriers with over 900 aircraft. The numbers already tell the story, but numbers alone cannot capture the gulf that has opened between these two forces. Japanese pilots, many with only a few months of training, fly obsolete aircraft against American defenses that resemble nothing seen earlier in the war. American carriers now bristle with radar-directed anti-aircraft guns. New proximity-fused shells explode near aircraft automatically, requiring no direct hit. American fighters, the new F-6F Hellcats, outperform Japanese Zeros in speed, firepower, and ruggedness. The battle begins when Japanese aircraft launch their first strike. American radar picks them up 70 miles away. Hellcats scramble and intercept the Japanese formations before they reach the American fleet. The result resembles organized slaughter more than aerial combat. Japanese planes fall by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Those few that penetrate to the American carriers face walls of anti-aircraft fire that destroy most before they can attack. Wave after wave, Japanese aircraft disappear into the American defenses. American pilots, many veterans of months or years of combat, methodically destroy the inexperienced Japanese formations. By day's end, Japan loses 3 aircraft carriers and over 600 aircraft. American losses total 123 aircraft and minor damage to 1 battleship. American pilots coin a phrase for the day's action, the Great Marianas Turkey. Shoot. The name captures both the one-sided nature of the combat and the confidence that now characterizes American naval aviation. What would have been an epic battle in 1942 has become target practice in 1944. In Japanese naval headquarters, Admiral Toyoda reviews the reports. The numbers are catastrophic, but worse than the losses is what they represent. The cream of Japanese naval aviation has been destroyed. Years will be required to train replacement air crews, years Japan does not have. The carriers that survive return to port where they will remain, unable to operate without trained pilots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively ends Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. Future battles will see desperate expedients. Kamikaze attacks by pilots with minimal training, carriers used as decoys because they lack sufficient aircraft, naval forces that cannot coordinate with air support because the air support no longer exists. October 1944. General Douglas MacArthur prepares to fulfill his promise to return to the Philippines. The invasion fleet assembles off Leyte Gulf, protected by the most powerful naval force ever gathered in the Pacific. Hundreds of ships, from battleships to landing craft, blanket the ocean. American air superiority is so complete that Japanese aircraft rarely appear over the invasion beaches. Japan's naval command faces their endgame. The remaining battleships and cruisers, unable to operate with air cover, plan a desperate thrust through Philippine waters to attack the invasion fleet directly. They hope that surprise and darkness will offset American advantages. The plan requires dividing forces and accepting near-certain destruction of the decoy element. It is the strategy of desperation, but also the only strategy available. The resulting Battle of Leyte Gulf becomes the largest naval battle in history. For 3 days, ships clash across hundreds of miles of ocean. American forces destroy 3 Japanese battleships, including the mighty Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever built. 4 carriers sink, 10 cruisers go down. Thousands of Japanese sailors die in the chaos of battle. The Americans lose 1 light carrier and 2 escort carriers to conventional attack, and several more ships to the first organized kamikaze strikes. But these losses barely dent American naval power. For every ship Japan sinks, 5 more American vessels stand ready. The mathematical reality that has defined the Pacific War since Midway reaches its logical conclusion. When Leyte Gulf ends, the Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceases to exist as a fighting force. The remaining ships, including the super battleship Yamato, will never again conduct meaningful operations. Japan has lost the tonnage war, the training war, the technology war, and the industrial war. American shipyards tell the final story. In 1944 alone, American yards commissioned 17 fleet carriers, 36 escort carriers, 63 destroyer escorts, and hundreds of smaller vessels. Total American naval tonnage exceeds 13 million tons. Japan's entire navy, at its peak, totaled less than 2 million tons. The statistics extend beyond ships. American aircraft production in 1944 reaches 96,000 planes. American factories produce more ammunition in 1 month than Japan manufactures in 6. The American economy grows during the war years while Japan's shrinks. Americans experience rationing and shortages, but these represent mild inconveniences compared to the deprivation gripping Japan. The realization came gradually, then all at once. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese planners believed they had crippled American naval power for years. At Midway, they learned that American intelligence and determination could overcome Japanese tactical advantages. In the Solomons, they discovered that American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. At the Philippine Sea, they witnessed the destruction of their naval aviation. At Leyte Gulf, they watched their surface fleet disintegrate. But the true realization was not about any single battle. It was the recognition that they had initiated a war they could never win. Japan's military excellence, its superior tactics, its warrior spirit, none of these could overcome the fundamental arithmetic of industrial warfare. America possessed the resources, the factories, the raw materials, and the population to wage total war on a scale Japan could not match. Admiral Yamamoto understood this from the beginning. He warned his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that a prolonged war with America could have only one outcome. His prediction proved remarkably accurate. 6 months after Pearl Harbor came Midway. 1 year after Pearl Harbor, American forces were advancing up the Solomon Islands. 18 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan was in retreat. The day Japan realized America's naval might was not December 7, 1941, when they struck Pearl Harbor. It was not June 4, 1942 at Midway. Though the lesson began there, it was the accumulated weight of every subsequent battle, every production report, every strategic calculation that showed the gap widening inexorably. By 1945, the question was not whether Japan would lose the Pacific War, but only when and at what cost. The naval war had become a demonstration of industrial capacity waged on the largest stage in history. And in that contest, America's advantages proved as overwhelming as they were decisive. The sleeping giant once awakened had proven unstoppable.